Good evening. Hello. Hope you had a good last week. We're just going to give it a moment as people join us. If you're local around here, you know it's carnival season. Uh, Last week was Bridgewater. This weekend was Glastonbury, which this year was even larger. And if you went along, I hope you had a safe and a fun evening, that you didn't get too cold, and that you just enjoyed some of the celebrations that go on. It is a curiosity of our part of the world, the way in which carnival season is such a big deal. Um, it's one of the few things I think in the calendar that, even though I hadn't been for quite a few years, I sort of miss being out and about, seeing the great crowds of people, and seeing for the few weeks beforehand all the floats lined up on the roads around here as they queue them up, ready to take them down the routes that go through the middle of our towns. It's an exciting time of year. It sort of signals for me that we're well on our way into the festive season. Tonight we're going to have a look at something which starts with some honesty about the world we live in, but then very quickly realizes that that's not the main event. If you've been listening to the news at all this last couple of weeks, you will have heard all sorts of examples of, well, to be blunt, the Lord's name being taken in vain. People, rightly or wrongly, attributing certain attitudes, thoughts, behaviors, patterns, failures to God's people, and attributing them to God's people in a way that presents it as though somehow that's his responsibility. There are some who are doing it in a positive light. They're claiming that some occurrence, some result, some pattern of behavior or whatever is God's plan, when the Bible tells us that time and chance happen to us all. And others are blaming God's people for the abhorrent behavior, the institutional failures that will very much come down to people being people. And I don't want to get into all the different news stories that you might have heard where people have said, oh, Christians do this, or Christians do that, or the church does this, or the church does that. I want to come at it from a slightly different perspective. There's an illustration that I've used a lot in schools over the years, and I tend to ask one of the students what their name is. And so for tonight's purpose, I want you to imagine I'm using your name. And I tell this story. I say, well, now I know what your name is. Imagine I was arrested for a series of horrible crimes. I'd done some terrible things. And when they interviewed me in the police cell and they asked me to do it, I said, oh, yeah, absolutely, I did it. I did it because, and insert your name here, because that person told me to. It wouldn't matter whether you had or you hadn't. It wouldn't matter whether you knew me or you didn't. It wouldn't matter whether everything I was accused of was the sort of thing that you could be accused of or was completely abhorrent to you. I just decided I would use you as my excuse for my behavior. There'd be no fairness in that. You could quite rightly feel that you had been affronted, that it was unfair, unreasonable, inappropriate to use your name in that way. Every time you hear a news broadcast blaming the church for the behavior of an institution, remember that the church is not an institution. The church is not found in one denomination. It has no humans as its head. It is answerable only to Jesus Christ. It is made up of individuals out of every tongue and tribe and nation, out of every identity, out of every place, in every generation, who personally are accountable to God for their actions. And you can't spot them by saying, well, who went to church? That is, who went to a meeting, a service, a gathering on a Sunday or a Saturday or a Wednesday or whenever else it is. They might say they were part of it. You can't spot it by somebody who wears a particular kind of religious outfit or somebody who has a particular religious title. You can't spot it. The church is, in fact, those who have been changed, been transformed, been redeemed, those who have been made new, and those whose life is now not theirs, but the life of Jesus Christ. And the reason religion hates that so much is it seems like an impossible standard. And the reason that religion hates it so much is it means that no matter who you are, where you're from, no matter what you look like, no matter what the world might think of you, if you are in Christ, the promise that he left us is true. You have become a child of God and you are a person who shares in his nature. Now you have been made free, and what you do with that freedom is your responsibility. But the church is what he says it is, not what the media says it is, not what denominations say it is. And it's important to remember that. And so as the news cycle, I guess particularly with the American election and with some pretty devastating reports into institutional religion here in the UK and all the different things that go on, as the news cycle continues, how do we keep our focus? As there are all the rumors and the threat of war that looms ever larger, how do we keep our focus? Well, we're going to look tonight at an account of Jesus' disciples being exposed to the violent storms of Galilee. And Jesus walking to them, it's a well-known story. And as I read this account from Matthew 14, certainly if you've ever been around Sunday school, you would have been told that you should look to Jesus instead of the storm, that you should fix your eyes on him instead of the storm, that the storm is the problem. But tonight we're going to look at the fact that there was more going on and there were better reasons to get out of the boat than just fear of the storm. This is in Matthew 14, starting at verse 22. Immediately, Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, while he sent the crowds away. And when he had sent the crowds away, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. Now, when evening came, he was alone on the mountain, but the boat was in the middle of the Sea of Galilee, tossed about by the waves, for the wind was against it. Now, on the fourth watch of the night, Jesus went to his disciples walking on the sea. And when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were troubled, saying, "It's a ghost!" And they cried out for fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them and said, "Be of good courage. It's me. Don't be afraid." And Peter answered him and said, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." So Jesus said, "Well, come on then." And when Peter had come out of the boat, he walked on the water to go to Jesus. But when he saw that the wind was boisterous, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, saying, "Lord, save me." And immediately Jesus stretched out his hand and caught him and said to him, "Oh, you of little faith, why did you ever doubt?" And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased. You know, when we're thinking about focusing our attention on Christ in amongst all the other noise, all the storms, all the circumstances, all the stories, all the negativity, all the misidentifying of Jesus, it's not just the storms that we have to ignore. See, quite often we find ourselves in a boat, in fellowship, in circumstances, in surroundings, whether it's through work colleagues or family members or just what we might consume on social media or whatever influences there are in our lives. We're in a boat with people who have misidentified Christ. When the disciples saw Jesus coming to their rescue, he's walking on the sea because he knows they're in trouble. When they see him coming, they panic and say, "It's a ghost," and become even more afraid. You know, if you hear people misidentifying Jesus, you need to think quite seriously about getting out of the boat. In recent years, we've heard people claiming that Jesus would exclude folk. It's not what the Bible teaches. The Bible teaches that he's never cast anyone aside, that he's never turned anyone away, that he hasn't got any favoritism, that he is, to use the old language of some of our English translations, he's no respecter of persons. That is to say, he doesn't care whether the world says you're great or the world says you're terrible. He doesn't care if society says you're important or society ignores you. He's not interested in being told all the terrible tales of your past, all the reasons you should be ashamed or frightened to come into his presence, because the reality is this: he has said, "Whosoever chooses to may come." It's what they said about him. In his earthly ministry, this man receives sinners You know, it was the religious folk talking, because who else says, oh, these people are sinners? Jesus doesn't exclude people. Jesus doesn't keep folks at arm's length. Jesus is being misidentified by those who dare to claim that exclusion, constraint, rejection, condemnation is of Christ. It simply isn't. And so if there are folks in your boat and they're misidentifying Jesus, get out of the boat. You see, misidentifying Jesus causes people to panic and be afraid. There are folks today who are talking about the things that are happening in the world, the time and chance which happens to all of us, the breakdown of climate, which is a consequence of our own actions, which catches people more often than not because they're in poverty or they're in denial. It's looking at those things and attributing them to the wrath of God, but these are the days in which God has put off his judgment. That is to say, he has forestalled it. He has given us a day of grace in which we can come to faith without facing the immediacy of the consequences of guilt and shame and fear. And there are people caught up in the storms of this world, the physical, natural storms, or in the devastating circumstances of conflict. And they are not condemned by God. And so if you hear people saying that Jesus is bringing about, or his Father is bringing about devastation, destruction, harm, and terror in people's lives, they are misidentifying Christ, and you need to get out of that particular boat. There are those at the moment who are claiming that Jesus is on one side or the other, whether on one side of the fight or on the other, whether on one side of a political argument or another, whether on one side of an ethnic or a national division or another. The reality is that not one of us deserves his affection or attention, but there's not one of us who is excluded from it. There are people claiming that Jesus is taking any side except for his own. Remember the story of Joshua standing before Jericho, and the Lord's messenger, and it is an image of Christ, stands between him and the city that he has been sent to overthrow. And so Joshua, being on watch, shouts across to the figure he sees, whose side are you on, theirs or ours? And the response comes, neither. But as commander of the host of the Lord have I now come. You know, that answer is one of the most challenging to all human ideas of being on the right side. There is no doubt that Jericho is going to fall. There is no doubt that in the main, there is a stronger probability that somebody who is standing on the same side of the fight as Joshua is likely to be at least looking to God to be their rescuer and their deliverer and their strength. But the truth of the matter is there are people in that city as well who are also on the Lord's side. If there are people in your boat and they're co-opting Jesus to their particular position, or they're claiming that he takes their side over someone else's, instead of bowing their knee and surrendering to the fact that they are on his side, instead of saying that he's in charge, that he's the commander of the host of the Lord, instead of saying we'll be on his side and we'll let him decide who that causes us to stand with. Anybody who tries to claim that it's their side to which Jesus rallies, well, they're misidentifying Christ, and you need to get out of their boat. Don't let others in your boat lie to you about the identity of Christ. It causes more fear. It causes more division. It causes more chaos. It does nothing to address the storms. All it does is render the people who should be looking to Christ helpless, terrified, bewildered, and inactive. Immediately, Jesus spoke to them, saying, be of good cheer, or of good courage. It is I. Do not be afraid. And Peter answered him and said, Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water. So Jesus said, come. Jesus will never turn down an honest request for reassurance. Never. You won't find it anywhere in Scripture. It doesn't matter who it is. It doesn't matter how extreme it is. When somebody cries out to him for refuge, for reassurance, for comfort, he delights to give it. Can you imagine how religious folk would have responded if one of them had come back from the dead and then someone had said, yeah, I don't believe you, prove it? And yet what we see with Jesus, as Thomas doubts the reality of his physical resurrection, he says, come on then, put your hand into my scar. Touch where the spear went into my side. Touch the scars on my hands, so that you no longer have to doubt, but you can be believing. There is a compassion to Jesus, a compassion that runs to everyone who cries out to him and says, God, I need you to help me. To the Father who's there, who knows that God is able, but is not yet convinced that God is going to, who says, I believe, help my unbelief. Jesus has some pretty strong words for the disciples, but to that Father, he gives refuge. And he answers his cry for healing, and the boy is not only healed, but also delivered from that which was oppressing him. You can go to God and say, God, show me that it's you. God, speak again in my experience. God, I think I heard you, but you know that I'm frightened, and you know that I get confused easily. Can you help me again to understand it? Willing hearts can reach out to him for reassurance. It doesn't matter what the circumstances are. It doesn't matter that there's some obvious thing that maybe others would say they should be dealing with. Peter, you're the fisherman who probably owns the boat. Peter, you're the most experienced. Peter, you're meant to be the leader. Peter, what are you doing getting out of the boat? I just need to get to Jesus, said Peter. If that's him, I'm not sitting around here with you lot who didn't believe him. I'm going out where he is. You see, sometimes you won't get your answer until you're willing to be where Jesus is, walking in what he's walking in, living the way he lives. It doesn't always mean you have to leap out the boat. It doesn't always mean that you have to go places where you sense jeopardy or physical risk. What it means is this, that you can't make a condition of Jesus' work in your life, or his reassurance, or his direction, or his comfort, or his presence being, well, you've got to come to where I'm at. You've got to come to where I'm comfortable. You've got to come to where I am able to do the things, or hold the position, or be the sort of person that the world around me wants me to be. Jesus, I so desperately need your words of eternal life. I'm going to be willing to come where you are, to walk the way you do, to rest on you, rely on you, and trust you, even in the journey required to get me the answer that I seek. So Jesus says to him, come on then. It's impractical. Religious folk would say it was unnecessary. But one of his beloved children has asked, one of his disciples who's his friend, someone that means no more to him than you do, said, Jesus, if it's you, let me come to you. She said, come on then. And so Peter gets out the boat and he walks on the water to go to Jesus. I just want to say at that point, don't ever be critical of somebody who's drowning in the middle of the ocean. If you can't see a boat, they got there somehow, and it was either by just sheer will and commitment that they swam there or they walked there. But once he's walking on the water, he begins to understand just how rough it is, just how terrible it is. Years ago, on church holiday one time, we used to hire the boats most years, and just the little fishing boats, the sort of the luggers in beer, and then take them out into the sea a little bit, barely out to the mouth of the bay. I mean, so close you could swim back to shore, really. But sometimes it looked really very smooth. But when you're in a boat that's that small, all of a sudden, fairly small waves look like very big waves. I remember on one occasion, a couple of young families wanted to come in a boat. And so we got them into the boat, and we got the children into the boat, and the children seemed quite delighted with the sort of rocking about and the various experience of the waves splashing and the rest of it. But the parents weren't so keen. And I won't tell you who they were, but they know who they were. And so the next thing, they were back out of the boat. And over the years, they've always said, oh, we were worried that it might be a bit too much for the children. But the truth of the matter is, maybe you like boats, maybe you don't. When you're down in amongst it, all of a sudden the waves seem an awful lot bigger and the sea seems an awful lot more terrifying and an awful lot more vast. So don't you be condemning somebody because they set out well, but now the storm is starting to distract them. You help them get their eyes back to Jesus. And so Peter has come out of the boat. He's walking on the water, but when he begins to understand the severity of the storm, he becomes afraid and begins to sink. And so he cries out saying, Lord, save me. You know, better admit that you're sinking than try and duke it out and drown. Better admit that you're afraid than try and act like you don't need to be comforted. But better to admit that you're sinking than to be willing to call on God and get help. You know, sometimes we're so convinced that we have to show off that we're mature Christians, or that we've got so much faith, or that we're not intimidated, or that we're somehow living a victorious life, that even though we are children in the household, even though we're told time and time again that we have his divine nature, but we have not yet attained to the fullness of his stature. That is to say, we are children growing up to become like him, and we have not yet learned what it is to be exactly as he is. We forget that children sometimes need comfort, and that sometimes they can't reach, and that there are things they haven't learned yet. And that's who we are in the household of God. You know, we need to call on God whenever, however, and not be ashamed to do it when people are watching, not be ashamed to do it when people ask us questions, not be ashamed when our only response to circumstances, unless he gives us something to say, to do, to be, is going to be a response of fear and drowning. Don't let religion convince you that you've got to look dry, happy, and as though you're oblivious to the storm before you ask God for help. If you're sinking, cry out, because the storm is always too much for us. But it's much easier to see Jesus if you're not watching your own step. Religion says you can fix this sinking thing if only you walked better. But you can't watch your own feet and watch the face of Jesus. Get your eyes on Jesus. Final thing we're going to look at this evening is this. You can only change the direction, the circumstances, and the fate of the people in the boat if Jesus takes you back to it. This is one of the most important things to learn. Evangelical religion has told people, you have a job to do, go away and do it. Jesus says to his disciples who have that exact same job, don't move a muscle until you've received the power to do the job. Peter has been in the boat with the other disciples. While he's walking on the water, they're still fighting the storm. He's got his eyes fixed on Jesus. His relationship to the water has changed. And when he becomes frightened, he can reach out and he can grab hold of the hand of Jesus, because Jesus responds to the cry, save me, Lord. They're still in the boat, paddling like crazy. They're still in the boat, shipping water. They're still in the boat, and the wind is thoroughly against them. But Peter now can't do anything for the people in that boat unless Jesus takes him back to it. And when Jesus takes him back to it, it is not the presence of Peter that's an extra set of arms on the oar, but the presence of Christ with Peter arriving in the boat that causes the wind to stop resisting. That's what it says. When they got into the boat, the wind ceased. You know, over the years, I've met a lot of people and they've clambered into someone else's boat to try and help. And all that's happened is it sat a little bit lower in the water, and now the two of them are getting soaked, and the two of them are at risk of drowning, and the boat's still not going anywhere. You can't change the outcome of someone else's life unless you arrive, because Jesus brought you there. You can't change the circumstances of the people around you, the community that you're a part of, or the lives of the people that you love, unless Jesus brings you back to it to transform the experience of the boat, because it will be God who changes their outcomes, not you. It will be God who brings peace to their circumstances, not you. You know, right now, there are people around the world saying, what are we supposed to do? How are we supposed to react? How are we supposed to respond? How can we fix it? It seems very likely that there's going to be a huge increase in poverty again over the coming months here in the UK as a result of some budget choices and as a result of economic circumstances and what's going on in the world. What can we do about it? How can we can say, Jesus, I'm going to keep my eyes fixed on you. I'm going to take a hold of your hand. Jesus, because I feel like I'm drowning in this storm too. I'm going to cry out to you, save me, Lord, knowing that you'll be my strength and you'll be the one who rescues me. And my rescuer is good to rescue everybody who was in the same boat as me. But I can't go back to it on my own. Because between me and that boat is the possibility of drowning. Between me and that boat is my weakness, my inadequacy, and those things which without God will be impossible. So now my only path back to it is if he brings me, because when we together get into the boat, no one else in that boat was going to go walking on the water to bring Jesus to them. They all thought they were seeing something that wasn't Christ at all. Sometimes it takes one to say, do you know what? I think I recognize Christ. I think I recognize his love, his compassion, his mercy. I think I recognize his goodness. But I don't see how that works in the storm. I don't know how that relates. And there's all these people around me and they're just screaming and panicking and misidentifying the God that I serve, saying that what seems to me to be his character, his love, his compassion, his salvation, his deliverance, his life transforming hope, for some reason it doesn't line up with their view. Well, I don't care about their view. I'm going to get to Jesus and I'm going to go to him where he is and I'm going to learn from him and I'm going to keep my eyes fixed on him, and he's going to be the only one who rescues and delivers me, because my strong deliverer can deliver the people in my boat too. You can only change the direction and circumstances of your boat if Jesus leads you into it. And so right now, wherever you are in the world and whatever you're going through, whatever circumstances have got your attention, whatever struggles you feel like you're a part of, whatever things the folk in your boat, in your community, in your family, in your workplace are facing, don't let the people around you misidentify Jesus. Don't let them attribute the struggles of this present time to him. Time and chance happen to us all. Don't let them claim that he would exclude, that he would isolate, that he would mistreat, that he would fear or abuse people. That's not him either. Don't let them claim that he would condemn people and dismiss them as worthless. That's misidentifying Christ. You know him better than that. You know that he receives all who come to him in faith. You know that he goes to the whosoever will. You know that he takes the weak to shame the strong and the foolish to shame the wise. You know that he is no respecter of persons, that he doesn't show favoritism. You know that whoever is in him is new. You know that he breaks down every barrier, that he goes to people of every identity. You know that because he came to you just like he came into my life. And above all else, he'll give you the comfort, the direction that you seek. He'll let you come to wherever he is. Even if it takes a miracle to get you there, even if it means that you'll be walking in the impossible, you can ask him to call you forward and he will. And when he does, don't look at the storm. And if you feel like you're drowning, don't wait, don't hold back, because there is no shame in crying out, Lord, save me. The only way we're going to get through these seasons, the only way that we're going to be able to walk faithful in it, the only way we stand any chance of transforming the lives around us for the better with the grace and mercy and the salvation of Jesus Christ, is if we get to him, no matter where it takes us, and we only get back in the boats that he brings us to, knowing that it's his presence and his power and his grace and not ours that will change the outcomes for the people that we live amongst. Keep your eyes on Jesus, folks. That's our thoughts for this evening. God willing, we'll see you next week. You can find the details below these. We're going to start in the run-up to Christmas Our Sunday night live streams are going to take a slightly different format. You've seen us do these solid weeks of series, but in the remaining Sundays before Christmas, starting next week, we're going to start thinking about the incarnation. We're going to start thinking about what exactly we're celebrating. With all the other things that are going on, all the different celebrations and seasonal things that are happening, we're going to start to really come to focus in on, well, what is this extraordinary moment we're talking about when God became one of us for the purpose of being Savior and friend and Lord. So that's coming up as we get in. I'm aware that next Sunday is not quite into December. It'll be the following week that will be our first Sunday in December, but I couldn't get it down to just the sessions for those last 4 Sundays. So for the 5 Sundays building up to Christmas, starting next week, we're going to spend some time looking at the incarnation each Sunday night. And God willing, that'll be a real blessing. I hope that you join with us. We've got a few other bits hopefully coming up that we'll tell you about as we get nearer the time. But the Lord bless you. Have a fantastic week, and God willing, we'll see you next Sunday. Good night.